apocalyptic theme. And it's easy to understand why. Jesus says in verses 7 and 8, when you hear wars and rumors of wars, don't be alarmed, they must take place. But the end is still to come, for nation will rise up against nation and kingdom against kingdom. But there will be earthquakes in various places, there will be famines. But this is the beginning of the birth pains. Hard to deny the judgment in the text is quite clear. It's right there. But I would submit to you, there are two types of judgment that are happening in the text. The first and the most obvious are what people say the end times. The moment when God says to the forces of the world, enough. Is that God saying enough? Or is that humankind saying enough? Our leaders can't seem to agree on the threat of global warming. Some prefer to maintain the scientific hopes. Melting polar caps are not enough. Increased severity of the storms around us, not enough. The mere fact that earlier this week, Monday or Tuesday, depending on when you live in the Bay Area, you could have walked around in shorts in November. Not enough.
Come on now. Make it plain.
How long will this go on? Will we, by human hands, come to a point to where Mother Nature says, enough?
Ooh, my Lord.
The end times is the obvious concern of the disciples in the text. Look at verses 3 and 4. When he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, opposite the temple, James, Peter, John, and Andrew asked him privately, tell us, when will this be? And what will be the sign that all these things are to be accomplished? Tell us, Jesus, make us privy to one of the mysteries of life. Tell us what has been kept hidden from Moses and Abraham and Joshua and Job and David and Solomon, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Daniel, Ezekiel, Amos, Noah, Jonah, and Micah. Is there anything to be gained from such understanding? If you did know, what good would it do you? Would you sell your house? What would you do if you had the information? But the other problem with that is that it also is a misuse of our faith. See, faith is not designed to unpack the mysteries of life. Its purpose is to help us cope with the complexities of life. That was the main message in the book of Job. Job, anguishing over his unjust suffering, wondered why God would not address his condition in a manner that Job wanted. Finally, God does respond, and Job can't handle the response. Where are you, Job, when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you understand. Who laid the cornerstones when the morning stars sang together and all the heavenly beings shouted for joy? Such questions go beyond the limits not only of Job's understanding, but it also exceeds the boundaries of our faith. Faith is not there to help you understand why absurdity arbitrarily knocked on your door at 1 o'clock in the morning. It is there to guide you and comfort you when that happens. Faith can never completely explain why you didn't get the job you so desperately wanted and received the pink slip that you didn't need. But faith is there to be with you in the time of trouble. Faith has no definitive answer as to why when you try to do good, evil's always present. Faith is there to remind you that evil does not and will not have the last word. Faith is there to remind you that God's grace is sufficient. Faith is there to remind you that if God is for us, who can possibly be against us? Faith is there to remind us that all things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to God's purpose. Faith is there to remind you that he that spared not his own son, but gave him up for us all, will also be there for us. Faith is there to remind you that God will give you peace, that God will give you joy, that God will give you hope, that God will give you a second chance, a brand new start, that God will pick you up, that God will make your enemies get out of your way, that God will put your feet on solid ground. That's the purpose of faith. Therefore, I'm not sure how productive it is to use our time focused on an apocalyptic end of the world ultimately, because whatever's going to happen is going to happen.
Come on.
Whether you want to say that's God, or you just want to say that's Mr. Charlie, you misusing the world's resources. This is a commercial, but many of you saw BP oil settle this week. $4 billion over 6 years. You know how much BP oil made last year? What? $285 billion. So BP giving $4 billion over 6 years is like me giving y'all $20 over 10 years. But the point is, whatever's going to happen, it's going to happen. And some of what happens is our own hand, and we ought not to be blaming that on God. God did not start wars. But debating the end times is not a good use of our time. But there is an end time that we should be debating. See, the more immediate judgment that you and I should be concerned with deals with the judgment that I do believe is placed on every church. Now, if there's an end time we should be concerned with, it is the judgment that God places on the church. There is no better way for the church to rendezvous with its own apocalypse than to look at that which is not important.
Come on now.
It does not require the church be met with God's wrath in order to meet the end. It cannot simply achieve its end by conforming to society. See, just because the church is thriving and they're filled to the rafter does not mean that they haven't met with the end times. Doesn't mean they have not faced God's wrath. It only needs to be silent in the wake of injustice, reluctant to speak truth to power, fail to see humanity in the least of these, offer no alternative for the greed that's so pervasive in society, in fact, actively participating in it. That could be the end of the church right there. Churches that engage in the adulterous behavior of worship rather than stopping on the Jericho Road. Churches that believe that the church is the building rather than the community. Churches that cannot see the need of the community in which it exists are guilty of not looking at what's important. When we become focused on what's not important, we lose focus on God. That's why Jesus says in verse 5, beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, I am he. And they will lead many astray. By focusing on what's not important, increases the possibility we will focus on what we want to hear. And just about anybody can tell you what you want to hear. Whether it's church, whether it's politics, whether it's just your favorite reality TV show. We gravitate to what we want to hear. In fact, if it was based on what you want to hear, you don't necessarily need to hear a message based on forgiveness, grace, and mercy. You don't have to be self-reflective. And you don't have to concern yourself with becoming a better person if it's just about what you want to hear. It's about what I want to hear. I want somebody to tell me how they like how my long flowing hair looks right now. It's about what I just want to hear. I could go an entire year and maybe more and never remind you of the necessity of engaging in inconvenient love. Because we never have to talk about love your neighbor as yourself. Don't even talk about love your enemies. Don't talk about stopping on the Jericho Road. That's fine. And all that's fine. You wouldn't miss it got tough.
Come on now.
For you, when you're faced with obstacles, setbacks, heartaches, disappointments, you will need to rely on the empty calories of being told what you want to hear. When we focus on what's not important, we become comfortable. And a comfortable church is not a growing church. And a church is not growing, and I mean this spiritually as well as numerically, is one that will ultimately meet an apocalyptic end. But ours is a faith based on not what we want to hear, but ours is a faith based on what we need to hear. There are difficult passages in the Bible, such as this morning's text, that don't always give us good news that we so desperately want to hear. Sometimes we need to hear it, especially when you've toiled week after week, feeling that you've been down more times than you've been up. This text, however, reminds us that nothing is to be gained by looking through the superficial lens of the external, what we see. This text reminds us that unless we are clear as to what Jesus says, who Jesus is, and what Jesus does, we might fall for anything and anyone. The text reminds us that just because somebody can make you shout doesn't mean they're getting you closer to a hill called Calvary that ultimately leads to resurrection. Just because they tickle your fancy and you want to fall out, don't mean you get any closer to God. It just means they're just singing your note. Hell, Luther Vandross can do the same thing, and you ain't got to go to church.
Come on now, please.
See, if you're unclear as to why you should do it, think back. If you're unclear on why you need to care about your neighbor and the stranger and engage in inconvenient love, if you're not sure about why you need to do those things, think about back on how God loved you when it seemed like the whole world hated you. Think about how he forgave you when you didn't deserve to be forgiven. Think about how when it was dark and he reminded you that the light shines in the darkness and darkness comprehended it not. Think about the times you were feeling weak and he reminded you that they didn't wait on